On March 24, 2015, at exactly 10:41 in the morning, an Airbus A320 carrying 150 people began an abrupt and deliberate descent over the remote mountains of Prads-Haute-Bléone, France. The aircraft was less than an hour into its flight from Barcelona to Düsseldorf. Air traffic control made repeated attempts to reach the pilots, but received no response. A perfectly sound machine, it simply kept losing altitude, headed directly for the jagged peaks below. Here's what every captain knows about this case. No mechanical failure could explain the trajectory. Why did an aircraft, designed with layers of redundancy, fly itself into a mountain range without a single distress call? The answer, as investigators would uncover, lay not in a malfunction of the machine, but in a deliberate act from within its own cockpit. I'm Captain James Harlow, and I've spent 28 years in that cockpit seat, flying these very machines. Look, I've sat in that exact seat, faced every kind of emergency procedure imaginable. Welcome aboard. Here's the thing. When an aircraft veers off course or begins an unexpected descent, our minds as pilots immediately run through a checklist. System malfunctions, weather anomalies, or maybe even a bird strike. You have to understand, the safety protocols designed to protect us from external threats were, in this instance, turned against us from within. And that's where it all went wrong. The reinforced cockpit door, designed to be impenetrable from the outside, was meant to be the ultimate safeguard against external threats. Think of it like a fortified strongroom for the flight deck. Its purpose was to keep danger out, ensuring that only authorized personnel could access the controls. But here's the thing. This very system allowed the flight crew inside the cockpit to manually lock the door, overriding any external keypad entry. It was a feature for extreme security, a final line of defense. In this particular case, that robust design, intended to secure the cockpit from outside threats, created a barrier no one could have ever foreseen from within. The aircraft, DAIPX, high over the French Alps, was about to become a contained environment where its safety measures would seal its fate. And that's where it all went wrong. The morning of Tuesday, March 24, 2015, began routinely for Germanwings Flight 525. The weather over Barcelona was clear, offering no challenges for departure. On board were 150 individuals. Let me tell you who these people were. Among them were 16 high school students and their 2 teachers from Haltern am See, Germany, filled with stories and laughter after a Spanish exchange program. There was also a young mother, Maria, traveling with her 7-month-old son, on their way to visit family in Düsseldorf. We also had Paul, a 52-year-old businessman, who, by sheer chance, missed his earlier flight connection and was rebooked onto this very Germanwings 525. He was heading home to Düsseldorf, perhaps looking forward to a quiet evening. The flight crew consisted of Captain Patrick Sondenheimer, a 42-year-old pilot with over 6,000 hours of flight experience, known for his calm demeanor and professionalism. He was a father of 2. His first officer was Andreas Lubitz, 27 years old, with 606 hours of flight time in the Airbus A320. Both completed their pre-flight checks, received their clearances, and began taxiing toward the runway. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the Airbus A320-2-11, registration D-AIPX, lifted off from Barcelona El Prat Josep Tarradellas Airport. This specific aircraft, with manufacturer serial number 147, was built in 1990. By the time of this flight, it had accumulated 58,313 hours in the air and 46,748 flights. Powering it were 2 reliable CFM-ICFM 56-5A1 engines. Look, this was not an old, unreliable aircraft. It was a proven workhorse, well-maintained and operating exactly as designed. The ascent was normal, with the aircraft performing precisely as expected. The pilots communicated with air traffic control, receiving instructions and reporting their position. They soon reached their cruising altitude of 38,000 feet, a flight level where the aircraft would typically fly for the majority of its journey on autopilot, requiring minimal input from the flight crew. The cabin crew began their service, and the passengers relaxed, some reading, some watching films, others simply gazing out at the clouds. It was a picture of calm efficiency, a testament to the reliability of modern air travel. Then, approximately 30 minutes into the flight, around 10:30 in the morning, as the Airbus was cruising at 38,000 feet, the captain made a routine announcement. He needed to step out of the cockpit briefly. This is a common occurrence on longer flights. Pilots take turns for restroom breaks or to stretch their legs. With the captain temporarily absent, the first officer was alone on the flight deck, a standard operating procedure. The reinforced cockpit door closed behind the captain. What happened next defied all expectations. Moments after the captain exited, at approximately 10:31 in the morning, the aircraft, instead of continuing on its programmed flight path at its assigned altitude, began an abrupt and deliberate descent. This was not a sudden drop or a violent plunge, but a steady, continuous loss of altitude. It was initiated by a manual input into the flight control unit from inside the cockpit. The autopilot was reprogrammed to descend at a rate of roughly 3,800 feet per minute. This rate, while alarming, was not indicative of a catastrophic structural failure, but rather a methodical input. Air traffic controllers, monitoring the flight, noticed the unexpected change in altitude. They attempted to contact Germanwings 525. Their voices, calm but persistent, crackled over the radio waves, asking for clarification, for confirmation of the aircraft's intentions. They received no reply. The silence was chilling. On the other side of that reinforced cockpit door, Captain Sondenheimer, now returning from his brief absence, realized something was terribly wrong. He used the keypad to enter the override code, a standard procedure for re-entry. But the door remained locked. He tried again, and again. The door, intended to protect the cockpit, was now keeping the captain out. It was an unyielding barrier. You have to understand, the default setting allows external key access after a 30-second delay, but an internal switch can override that, locking the door permanently from the inside. That internal switch had been activated by the first officer. The captain's initial knocking turned into frantic pounding. He called the first officer on the intercom. No answer. His calls to air traffic control, now relayed from the cabin, also went unanswered. The aircraft was descending, steadily, relentlessly, toward the unforgiving terrain below, and the person who could stop it was locked out. Here's the thing. At this point, the lack of communication and the unexpected descent immediately raised alarms among air traffic controllers and military authorities. Their first thoughts, understandably, turned to the most severe scenarios. Unlawful interference, perhaps a hijacking, or a sudden incapacitating event for the pilot remaining in the cockpit. Nobody saw this coming. The reinforced cockpit door, a post-September 11th necessity, was designed to prevent external threats. The idea that the pilot alone inside that secure space had actively commanded the descent was at that moment almost beyond comprehension. The radio waves, persistent, crackled over, asking for clarification, for confirmation of the aircraft's intentions. They received no reply. The silence from Germanwings Flight 525 was chilling. On the other side of that reinforced cockpit door, Captain Sondenheimer, now returning from his brief absence, realized something was terribly wrong. He used the keypad to enter the override code, a standard procedure for re-entry, but the door remained locked. He tried again, and again. The door, intended to protect the cockpit from external threats, was now keeping the captain out. It was a barrier, absolute and unyielding. You have to understand, the default setting allows external key access after a 30-second delay, but an internal switch can override that, locking the door permanently from the inside. That internal switch had been activated by the first officer, Andreas Lubitz. The captain's initial knocking turned into frantic pounding. He called the first officer on the intercom. No answer. His calls to air traffic control, now relayed from the cabin, also went unanswered. The aircraft was descending, steadily, relentlessly, toward the unforgiving terrain below, and the person who could stop it was locked out. Here's the thing. At this point, the lack of communication and the unexpected descent immediately raised alarms among air traffic controllers and military authorities. Their first thoughts, understandably, turned to the most severe scenarios: unlawful interference, perhaps a hijacking, or a sudden, incapacitating event for the pilot remaining in the cockpit. The reinforced cockpit door, a post-September 11th necessity, was designed to prevent exactly such external threats from gaining control. Inside the cockpit, First Officer Lubitz remained silent, unresponsive to all communications. The aircraft, DAIPX, continued its programmed descent, steadily losing approximately 3,800 feet per minute. At this rate, the ground was approaching with grim certainty. Air traffic controllers in Marseille, France, were now issuing urgent calls, their voices growing more insistent. They vectored other aircraft away from Germanwings Flight 90525's rapidly changing trajectory, clearing the airspace around what they now knew was a dire emergency. Calls went out to military authorities, who began preparing for a possible interception, a procedure reserved for situations of extreme threat or suspected unlawful interference. Here's the thing. For a brief, bewildering period, the primary theory among air traffic control and military personnel was that the aircraft had suffered a sudden, complete loss of communication due to an electrical failure, or perhaps that both pilots had become incapacitated. Another strong hypothesis was unlawful interference, a hijacking. This initial misdirection, this focus on external threats, consumed precious minutes, delaying the full understanding of the unfolding tragedy. Nobody saw this coming. The idea that a pilot, alone inside that secure space, could be deliberately flying the aircraft into the ground was almost unthinkable at the time. The protocols in place, the mental models of what constituted a threat, all pointed outward, not inward. And that's where it all went wrong. As the Airbus continued its descent, the cabin atmosphere shifted from unease to outright alarm. Passengers, particularly those seated by the windows, would have seen the rugged peaks of the French Alps growing larger, closer, far too quickly. The subtle changes in air pressure, the increasing hum of the engines as the airspeed built up, would have been unmistakable. The cabin crew, trying to maintain calm, would have found their efforts increasingly strained as the aircraft plunged toward the unforgiving terrain. You have to understand, these were people returning from vacations, business trips, exchange programs. They were ordinary citizens, now facing the extraordinary. Consider Maria, the young mother traveling with her 7-month-old son. She would have been holding her child close, perhaps trying to shield him from the rapidly intensifying fear. The growing sounds, the subtle lurches, the shouts from the front of the aircraft, all would have contributed to an escalating terror. What thoughts raced through her mind as the mountains filled the window? The instinct to protect her child would have been overwhelming.
Displaying altitude and airspeed decreasing rapidly, showing current altitude around 10,000 feet and increasing speed.
Inside the cockpit, the aircraft's automated systems, designed as a final layer of defense, began to activate. First came the audio warning, "Sink rate." This alarm, a clear and urgent voice, indicated that the aircraft was descending too fast, too aggressively. It was a command, a stark warning to the pilot to correct the trajectory immediately. This was followed by the insistent, chilling blare of terrain, terrain, pull up, the Ground Proximity Warning System, or GPWS. This system uses radar altimeters to detect how quickly the aircraft is approaching the ground, screaming for immediate, life-saving action. These were not gentle chimes. They were piercing, undeniable shouts, designed to shock any pilot into immediate corrective measures. Yet, the aircraft continued its descent, unwavering. The captain outside the cockpit, hearing the rising crescendo of these alarms, knew precisely what they meant. Every pilot does. It meant the aircraft was mere moments from impact. He shouted, "Open the damn door!" His desperation was palpable. The cabin crew, now acutely aware of the imminent catastrophe, could only listen to the terrifying cacophony from the flight deck and the captain's futile struggle. The aircraft was now passing through 6,000 feet, then 5,000, still at that deliberate descent rate of 3,800 feet per minute. Its airspeed was increasing, gaining momentum. On the ground, the French military scrambled fighter jets, but it was too late. At 10:41 in the morning, the Airbus A320, registration DAIPX, slammed into the slopes of the French Alps. The impact was immense, with the aircraft disintegrating into thousands of pieces across a remote, rugged mountainside. The force was catastrophic. At that moment, The flight data recorder, or FDR, which records all flight parameters, abruptly stopped. The cockpit voice recorder, or CVR, which captures all sounds in the cockpit, went silent. There were no survivors. 150 lives were extinguished in an instant. The silence that followed was absolute. As the Airbus A320 D-AIPX plunges through 4,000 feet, the piercing wail of "Terrain, terrain, pull up!" reaches a deafening crescendo. Inside the cockpit, First Officer Lubitz remains silent, his eyes fixed forward. The aircraft's speed builds, rushing toward the jagged rock face. Outside, Captain Sondenheimer knows. He hears the alarms, the roar of the engines, the tearing metal that is about to come. Passengers, strapped into their seats, feel the immense G-forces pressing them down. Their world blurs. Maria clutches her 7-month-old son, shielding him as the mountain peak fills the window. Paul, the businessman, braces for an impact no human can survive. There is a violent lurch, a sudden, incomprehensible jolt as the left wing strikes the mountain. Metal screams. The fuselage begins to tear apart. Fire erupts. The forces are beyond anything imaginable. The aircraft disintegrates. In milliseconds, 150 lives are gone. Absolute, terrifying obliteration. There were no recovery attempts to be made once the aircraft began to strike the mountain. The speed, the angle, and the sheer force of the impact meant that the disintegration was almost instantaneous. From the moment the first piece of the aircraft made contact, there was no longer a controllable machine. Physics dictates that at such speeds, against such solid terrain, there is simply no fight to be had. In the immediate aftermath, a profound silence fell over the French Alps. The air, once filled with the roar of an aircraft, now carried only the whisper of wind. On the ground, the initial military response, which had scrambled fighter jets, quickly shifted to search and rescue. But there was no rescue to be made. The remoteness of Prads-Haute-Bléone, combined with the catastrophic nature of the impact, meant that first responders faced an almost impossible task. The debris field was vast, scattered across treacherous mountain terrain. Within hours, the grim reality became clear. All 150 people on board Germanwings Flight 525 had perished. Authorities began the agonizing process of notifying families who had initially gathered at the destination airport in Düsseldorf, awaiting their loved ones. The world watched, horrified, as images of the devastated mountainside emerged. For the BEA, the French Accident Investigation Agency, the work began instantly. Their focus, understanding why a perfectly sound aircraft with a proven flight crew had vanished from the skies. For us in aviation, every accident is a lesson. The initial questions were overwhelming. Investigators needed to determine if this was a mechanical failure, an external attack, or something far more insidious. This was the beginning of an investigation that would challenge every preconception about aviation safety. First, the primary cause of the Germanwings 525 tragedy was the deliberate, calculated action of the first officer. Every layer of aviation safety, from the fundamental design of an Airbus A320-211 to the rigorous training pilots undergo, operates on a bedrock principle. The flight crew is the ultimate safeguard. They are the last line of defense against any conceivable threat, whether it is a system malfunction or an external force. This foundational trust was tragically inverted on March 24, 2015. The individual entrusted with protecting 150 lives instead chose to end them, deliberately flying a perfectly functional aircraft, DAIPX, into the ground. This was not a mechanical failure. This was not an act of God. It was a conscious, sustained choice to reprogram the autopilot, changing the target altitude to 100 feet and maintaining a steady descent rate of approximately 3,800 feet per minute. The training, the checks, the years of adherence to safety protocols, all were undermined by a singular, deliberate betrayal of trust that nobody saw coming. Here's the thing. For us as pilots, this kind of intentional act shatters every assumption we carry into the cockpit. We train for countless emergencies, but never for the absolute certainty of a colleague's deliberate malice. Second, the reinforced cockpit door, a critical safety measure implemented after the attacks of September 11, 2001, became an unwitting enabler of this disaster. Look, this door was engineered to be impenetrable from the outside, to protect the pilots from hijackers and external threats. Its purpose was to create an absolute barrier, safeguarding the flight deck. However, the system also incorporated a manual lock feature, allowing the flight crew inside to override external keypad entries or emergency codes. This internal override was designed for extreme security situations, such as a flight attendant attempting to force entry under duress from a hijacker or during an actual hijacking attempt. In the context of Germanwings 525, this very feature, designed to enhance security, was exploited. Once the captain stepped out for a routine break, the first officer activated that internal lock, effectively sealing himself inside and blocking all attempts at re-entry. The door, a symbol of post-September 11th security, became an insurmountable barrier, preventing the captain from regaining control and stopping the fatal descent. The system was designed to keep danger out, but it had no effective countermeasure when the danger was already within. And that's where it all went wrong. The irony here is profound. A security feature meant to save lives inadvertently sealed the fate of 150 people. Third, the existing protocols for crew incapacitation and cockpit access, while robust for typical scenarios, proved inadequate for a deliberate act by a pilot inside the cockpit. Standard procedures account for a pilot becoming incapacitated due to a medical emergency, for example. In such cases, the other pilot would take command, or if both were incapacitated, the cabin crew could attempt to gain access using emergency codes, assuming no one inside was actively preventing entry. The underlying assumption in aviation had always been that a pilot, even if incapacitated, would not actively thwart re-entry attempts. The idea of a pilot intentionally preventing colleagues from accessing the cockpit was, frankly, outside the scope of most established security and access protocols before this accident.
This presented a unique challenge. How do you force entry into a cockpit when the person inside is deliberately locking you out and actively endangering the aircraft? Here's the thing. The industry, as a whole, had focused intensely on preventing external threats. But the Germanwings accident highlighted a critical vulnerability to an internal threat that few had fully considered in their safety frameworks. This includes the then-existing mental health screening processes for pilots. While pilots undergo regular medical evaluations, the depth of psychological assessment and the protocols for continuous monitoring were not designed to detect or prevent such a specific, deliberate act of self-harm and mass murder. The Germanwings 525 tragedy forced a global reevaluation of cockpit security and pilot mental health protocols. Regulatory bodies like the European Union Aviation Safety Agency, or EASA, and the Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA, in the United States, immediately issued new directives. The most significant change was the implementation of what became known as the two-person cockpit rule. This mandate requires that at no time can a single pilot be alone on the flight deck. If one pilot needs to leave for any reason, a qualified member of the cabin crew must enter the cockpit and remain there until the returning pilot re-enters. This simple procedural change was a direct response to the specific vulnerability exposed by this flight. Beyond this, there was a renewed, deeper scrutiny of pilot mental health assessments, aiming to identify potential risks more effectively, though this remains a complex and sensitive area for the industry to navigate. The accident also spurred discussions about the potential for remote disabling of cockpit door locks, though this idea raises its own set of security concerns regarding external threats. The lessons learned from DAIPX continue to shape aviation safety, underscoring the constant need for vigilance and adaptation in an industry where the human element remains paramount. You have to understand, we in aviation learn from every incident. The investigation into Germanwings 525, led by France's Bureau d'Enquête et d'Analyse pour la Sécurité de l'Aviation Civile, the BEA, was exhaustive. Their final report confirmed the chilling truth. First Officer Andreas Lubitz, alone on the flight deck, deliberately initiated and maintained the aircraft's descent, actively preventing Captain Sondenheimer from re-entering. The BEA's findings highlighted a critical vulnerability in established safety frameworks, particularly how a single pilot could exploit security protocols and the urgent need for more robust pilot fitness evaluations, including comprehensive mental health assessments. You have to understand, this was a fundamental breach of trust that demanded immediate action. In direct response to this tragedy, the European Aviation Safety Agency, or EASA, issued a temporary recommendation on March 27, 2015. This quickly became a formalized rule known as the two-person cockpit rule for many operators worldwide, including mandates from the Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA, in the United States. This new procedure mandated that at least two authorized persons must always be present in the cockpit when the aircraft is in flight. If one pilot needs to leave, a cabin crew member must enter and remain until the pilot returns. This rule has undoubtedly added an essential layer of protection, preventing a single pilot from controlling the aircraft and sealing the door, thereby safeguarding countless lives globally by eliminating the precise vulnerability that allowed DAIPX to be flown into the French Alps. The 150 lives lost on that Airbus A320 DAIPX over the mountains of Prads-Haute-Bléone, France, reshaped an entire industry's approach to cockpit security and crew protocols, ensuring their sacrifice was not in vain. This case forces us to confront a profound paradox in aviation safety. The reinforced cockpit door, a direct response to an external threat, tragically became a tool for an internal one. Look, the implementation of the two-person cockpit rule was a necessary, immediate fix. But my question to those of you who understand the complexities of aviation is this: do you believe the industry has truly solved the underlying human element vulnerability exposed by Germanwings 525? Or has the two-person cockpit rule merely papered over a deeper issue regarding pilot mental health and internal threats? Share your perspective in the comments below. If this deep dive into Germanwings 525 resonated with you, please consider hitting the like button. It's a small, free gesture, but it helps this channel reach more people who are passionate about understanding the intricate world of aviation. And if you're new here, or you appreciate this kind of insider analysis, becoming a subscriber or a member is the best way to support what we do. This is an independent channel built on a shared passion for aviation safety and honest storytelling. Your support truly helps us continue to bring these critical lessons to light. I'm genuinely interested in your perspective on that difficult question we just discussed, so please, share your thoughts in the comments below.